Okay, so I have got a quadratic equation here for you, and I want you to solve it. I want you to find what value of x could we plug in for x here that would make this equation equal to 0. Well, let's think of what we've learned so far in this unit, okay? We have learned in this unit to solve quadratic equations. First off, we've learned how to solve a quadratic equation if it's without its linear term. Okay, but this very clearly has a linear term. It has this 12x, so that's out of the question. We can't do that. Now we've also learned how to solve a quadratic equation by using factoring. Okay, this is where we have to find two numbers that add up to 12 and multiply to 8. Now unfortunately in this case, it just flat out doesn't work. You could spend the rest of your lives trying to find two numbers that add up to 12, multiply to 8. Never going to happen. See, the problem with factoring is a great technique, but it does not always work. Sometimes it's impossible. And that doesn't even begin to mention, like, we haven't even talked about the fact if you have a leading coefficient here of like a 4, that actually changes the whole factoring thing anyway. So factoring just definitely isn't going to work in this case. So what can we do? Well, there's been a formula that's been developed. And I don't even know the history on this. I'd have to look up the history to tell you exactly when. But I'm going to slide this in front of you. There's a formula that has been developed. It's one of the most famous formulas in algebra. It is called the quadratic formula. And the beautiful thing about the quadratic formula, see, factoring is kind of a shortcut that works some of the times, but it doesn't work all of the time. Well, the quadratic formula, it works every time when you're trying to solve a quadratic equation. Okay, so definitely pause the video right now and write this down, and then when you unpause, I'll show you exactly how it's used. All right, so the way the quadratic formula is used is this. The coefficient of our quadratic term is called a. We're going to say a is equal to 4. And by the way, for this to work, our equation needs to be in standard form. It needs to be equal to 0, like this one is. Okay, now we're going to take the coefficient of our linear term, the 12, and we call it b. Likewise, we're going to take this constant term, this 8. We're going to call it c. And now it's a matter of plugging these numbers, and in this case, they're all positive. In some cases, you can definitely have a negative. But now we're going to take these numbers, the 4, the 12, the 8, and we're going to plug them in for a and b and c. So we have negative b plus or minus, we'll talk about that in a little bit, b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So I took these numbers, the 4, the 12, and the 8. Yep, I took those numbers, the 4, the 12, and the 8, and I plugged them into this formula like such. Now, when you open your assignment, you're going to find we're going to be doing this formula a lot in the upcoming weeks here through the rest of the semester. When you open up your assignment, I gave you a little PDF version of this. I call it a skeleton sheet. This is a sheet of paper that just kind of has the quadratic formula written out as like a skeleton. And I think it makes it really easy to plug in your numbers. So I'm going to actually use this little skeleton as I plug in my b is 12, and a is 4, and c is 8. You're going to see me as I do my notes. I'm going to be using this little skeleton quite a bit. So if that's something you're interested in, go on to Canvas and you can print this out and try it on your own. But so what we need to do now is we need to basically type this formula into our calculator and it will tell us the answers. Now, unfortunately for us, this formula is so complex, it is extremely challenging to try to type this into our calculator all at one time. There is so much going on here. There's a big fraction, there's a square root, there's this plus or minus sign. So what I recommend that you do, I always recommend to my students, break this down into steps. And let's actually start with the square root. When we take 12 squared, which is 144, minus 4 times 4 times 8, which is 128, and subtract those numbers, we get 16. And so I really encourage you, start with everything that's inside of this square root. And you could even type this in your calculator all at once if you wanted to. A lot of times, well, and I'd also get in the habit of kind of putting your values in parentheses. So I'm going to start with this. The 12 squared minus 4 times 4 times 8. That comes out to 16. Okay, so I've written this here as the square root of 16. And then I'm going to figure out what the square root of 16 is, which hopefully you know. That comes out to 4. If you don't know, use a calculator. So what I like to do is I like to say this entire square root, when I plugged it in my calculator, that all simplifies to just a 4. And so I'm going to put a 4 right here. Now, this negative sign here is going to take the 12, and it's just going to make it a negative 12. And then on the bottom of this fraction, I have a 2 times 4. That's going to become an 8. And so I like, for my very first step, I like to do these 3 things. Simplify the square root. It turns out to be just a 4. Take the opposite of whatever b is. That would make this a negative 12. And then multiply the 2 times 4. That makes this an 8. Now from here what happens is, let's talk now about this plus or minus sign that's in the middle of the problem. So this plus or minus sign is the key. Remember, a quadratic equation always has 2 solutions. Well, this plus or minus sign is the key on how we're going to get our 2 solutions. Because at this point, I'm going to draw 2 arrows out. And on the first arrow, I'm going to write 12 plus 4 divided by 8. And this is going to give me my first solution. With the bottom arrow, I'm going to write 12 minus 4 divided by 8. And this is going to give me my second solution. See, this plus or minus is a way for you to get your 2 solutions. To get the first solution, we add negative 12 plus 4. To get the second solution, we subtract negative 12 minus 4. Now, if you're doing this on your calculator, make sure you do have to add your numerator together first. Whoops, negative 12 plus 4. You have to add that together first before you try to divide. So this becomes negative 8 over 8. And sometimes I'll even put this in parentheses to remind you of that fact. We need to combine our numerator first before we try to divide by 8. But my first solution is negative 1. Likewise, down here, I need to subtract negative 12 minus 4 first before I divide by 8. The solution comes out to negative 2. So here is my solutions. My solutions are given directly here. Solution number 1 is negative 1. Solution number 2 is negative 2. So as I go back, let's go back to my original problem here. Here's what I'm going to write for my answers. Solution 1, x equals negative 1. Or I also have this solution 2, where x is equal to negative 2. Now the order doesn't matter. You can flip the order on this. Does not matter. Here's kind of how we would do a calculator check, and here's what this all means. Negative 1 or negative 2. I can plug either one of these numbers in for x, and especially make sure you're using parentheses to plug these numbers in here. So if I plug a negative 1 in for x, 4 times negative 1 squared plus 12 times negative 1 plus 8, guess what? That makes it come out to 0. Negative 1 is a number I can plug in for x that will make this equation equal 0. And there's proof. But not only does negative 1 work, so does negative 2. I can change this here and put a negative 2, plug in negative 2 into the original equation. Guess what? It also works. So these both check out. These are the values of x that make this equation equal to 0. And we were able to find this using what's called the quadratic formula. Hey, I will let you know, I'm not going to go into any proofs of the quadratic formula. If you ever want some extra work to do, by all means, do a Google search. Look on YouTube. There's good videos that show you how to prove that this formula works. I'm not going to go into any detail on today's lesson, but man, that's something you could try on your own if you're curious. So there it is. So let's do a second example with this, and let's make our second example. Let's give ourselves a lot of negative signs to work with. Okay, so here, now this one, you actually could solve this one by factoring. As a matter of fact, I challenge you to solve this by factoring, just to verify and see if we get the same answers either way. So if you want a little review of factoring, by all means, give that a shot. But that's just not what we're going to do right now. We're trying to learn this new technique called the quadratic formula that always works. So here, my a value, there is no coefficient in front of the x squared. You can put a 1 there. We're going to say a is equal to 1. You could also say that this a value is also known as the leading coefficient. So here you can say this has a leading coefficient of 1. Now here's our negative signs. Our b value, this has a subtraction in front of it. We're going to say -3. Here I have a subtraction, minus 10. I'm going to write that c is -10. Okay, so let's take these numbers, the 1, the -3, the -10, and plug it into the quadratic formula. Now I have my little skeleton I can use that I'm going to use. Now with the little formula, I encourage you, I think this little kind of skeleton is handy. You do have to remember where things go. The first two blanks are b's, -3, -3. This third blank here is the a. Oh, and also the last blank is also an a. And this fourth blank up here on the top is the c. Okay, so let me focus on this now. Let's start. We need to analyze this formula now. Let's really start with the square root. Now here's where parentheses are going to be so important when you have all these negative signs. So my advice in a calculator, I would focus on the -3 squared minus the 4 times 1 times -10. Now the minus signs can get kind of confusing with all these different subtraction sign and a minus sign here and a minus sign here. But as long as you enter this into your calculator, putting your inputs in parentheses, the -3, the 1, and the -10 in parentheses, we just use our standard subtraction sign in the middle. This will simplify. The b squared minus 4ac becomes a 49, but then don't forget, we still have to take the square root of that. So square root of 49, hopefully you know that's equal to 7. But what I can say is that this really complex part here, this whole radical sign, this square root with all these numbers inside, look how simply it reduces. It reduces to simply 7. Now here I have the opposite of -3. Here the two negative signs are going to make this a +3. And on the bottom, I have 2 times 1. That's just simply 2. Okay, see, if you can get from this first step is very complicated when you first plug in. But if you can get it to this step, it is so much easier from here. All right, so my first solution, I'm going to do 3 plus 7 divided by 2. And I'm going to do that in my head. 3 plus 7 is 10. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. There is my first solution. My second solution, 3 minus 7. I need to take the 3 minus 7 before I try to divide it by 2. 3 minus 7 is -4. Divide that by 2. I get -2. These are the solutions. 5 and -2. These are the numbers I could plug back into my original problem. And I promise you, if I were to plug a 5 or a -2 back into this original problem, I promise you it would come out to equal 0. And I'm not going to do that right now, but I would encourage you to give it a shot. Try plugging the 5 back in for x. You'll get a 0. Try plugging the -2 back in for x. You'll also get a 0. Okay? So hey, that's our introduction to the quadratic formula. Best of luck on this assignment. Bye.